Okay, so our next speaker is Professor Wilson Poon. His official title is a Chair of Natural Philosophy in the School of Physics and Astronomy here in Edinburgh, but he would like me to point out that he works on goo, condensed matter, active particles, structure of glasses and gels. And Wilson is also, of course, a Christian. He didn't come from a Christian family, but went to a missionary school in Hong Kong, where he became a Christian. And he's more recently been teaching theology at the University of Edinburgh, preaching in his previous church, and he really has a passion for a theology of science, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what he has to say. So thank you.
Right. Well, thank you very much for coming. Thank you for the organizers for allowing me to speak here. For those of you who have got long enough memory, last time when CiS met in Edinburgh, when I gave a talk, the title is exactly the same. So anyone who think they want to leave, just leave. So the material is the same, but it's in a different order. But as that I was in the Morecambe and Wise crack about the Greek piano concerto, the notes are all there, it's a different order. So hopefully I'm playing you a different piece this time, on the same 88 notes, hopefully. So I want to talk to you a little bit about what I call a theology of science. But I was very glad that what's happening in Scotland was highlighted, because I want to bring your attention to this, because a bunch of us in the Scottish Episcopal Church, early 2000s, decided that one way to get the church engaged with society in all kinds of ways, was to publish a yearly series of Grosvenor essays. Grosvenor Crescent is where the Scottish Episcopal Church headquarters is in the Edinburgh Diocese. So that's why they're called Grosvenor essays. And because Muggins couldn't shut up, Muggins got to help edit the first one. One should always shut up, but Muggins has never learned. So, in fact, the key word there is towards, okay? And there are sketches. So, this is us hedging our bets. It's not just towards the theology of science. It's sketches towards. So, this is work in progress. This was work in progress. It still is. So, this is kind of a progress report. You can download this on the Scottish Episcopal Church website, together with all the other wonderful Grosvenor essays. They're all free. Donations accepted. So what do I mean by theology of science? The interesting thing there is the of, is the preposition. So my now sadly late friend Tom McLeish and I, this is our hobby horse, we don't like, Tom and I I still don't like the and in science and religion. There are all kinds of reasons. One might not like that phrase. Peter Harrison, he didn't like it because the word science is problematic and the word religion is problematic. And I pointed out to Peter that if anyone ever invited me to give lectures, I would do in the third word, and. Peter left the word and. So I want to do in the word and. So in fact, what we need is a preposition, is theology of science. So, this was Tom's original metaphor, but he said, look, if you talk about science and religion, it makes science and religion sounds like two jars amongst other jars on the shelf. The other jars may be labeled art or sport or whatever you like, but they're all jars on the shelf of sort of fairly equivalent status. But if you take your religion seriously, as all Christian believers must, because we are called to follow Christ and to honor God with all our heart, our soul, our mind, our strength, if that is the case, if your religion is worth this pinch of salt, then religion should not be labeled as one of the jars. Religion should be the shelf. That's the shelf on which all the other jars sit. So it's not a matter of science and religion, that they're not equal status. Of course, there are people who worship science, for whom science is the shelf. But for me, religion is the shelf, on which all the other jars sit. So that's my problem with science and religion. It's a category mistake. I hope that's okay for philosophy. No, that is a category mistake. Right. So what I mean by theology of science, speaking as a non-theologian, is that this is a believer, this is me, a believer's attempt to articulate a view of science based on, and it's amazing how many things I want to say Joanna had already said. I can just sit down, because you had a whole 5 minutes on that stuff. So I had scripture, tradition, and experience. The only footnote is the word experience, interestingly, in French, expérience, and in Italian, esperienza, even today, means experiment as well as experience. And in fact, the word experience in English only got privatized roughly the time of Robert Boyle to John Milton. And in fact, when Robert Boyle talks about an experiment, he's also talking about his experience in his basement, pumping air out of a jar. And the way he started writing about those experiences was exactly the same as religious believers writing about their religious testimony. Schaeffer, this book, Social History of Truth, was very strong on that. The early attempts to write up experimental reports borrowed the language of reporting religious experience to convince someone who wasn't there that you're not lying. So, my experience here, I don't just mean inner movements of the Holy Spirit, I mean my experience in the laboratory as well in the science common room and all of that. So, Joanna had already talked about that. This is not a privatized thing. Okay, so I want to tell you and seek a conversation with you about my attempt to articulate how I view science, or the sciences, if I want to be slightly more accurate, based on scripture, tradition, and experience. And when I say science, the reason why I use the singular is that I actually want to not talk about any particular results of science. Whenever people ask me, how does this latest discovery relate to your faith, to a first approximation, the answer is not at all. Sorry, whether this latest discovery makes any difference to your faith, the answer is not at all. But I want to talk about the entire scientific enterprise. Now, of course, when does that start? It's all problematic, but I will define for you what I mean by science probably in the next slide. So how do I, as a practicing scientist, view the scientific enterprise as a whole as a field of human endeavor? And not about particular scientific results. So what is science? So to me, science is about giving naturalistic interpretations to the way things are. The key word there is naturalistic, but I'll come to explain that a little bit more in a moment. But the point is, this enterprise that we call science, I'm assuming that you intuitively know the kind of thing I'm talking about, is not only possible, you might think that is obvious, but it's not, I'll come back to that, it's possible. It's not only possible, but certainly for many of us who've got personal experience of us in the room, it's intellectually satisfying. And amazingly, it is practically useful. I still can't get over the fact that we can use Newton's laws, not even general relativity, to send someone, it was a man, to the moon and say, I want you to splash down there in the Pacific Ocean. And they do. You're making little charcoal marks on a piece of paper, as the movie has shown, a lot of time by women who are overlooked in the history of science. But anyway, people do calculations and you can do that, and it works. So, the fact that the scientific enterprise is not only possible, but it is satisfying, not only is it satisfying, but is actually useful, that's kind of interesting. I want to problematize that for you and want you to think about it with me today. So what do I mean by naturalistic? This is a famous cartoon. And every year, this time of the year, I confront this a lot in marking physics exam scripts. So you ask students to prove some result. So they do this derivation, and it goes wronger and wronger. It's a sort of word that Lewis Carroll would have used. It goes wronger and wronger. And then they know it is completely wrong because it doesn't get them anywhere near the result I asked them to prove. And then hopefully they say therefore and write the result down. In other words, here there's a miracle. They don't understand that therefore is an ethical claim. You ought to be able to trace the logic yourself, not just hope for it. Now the point is, ever since the modern scientific enterprise began, we collectively as humanity got used to the fact that it is possible to offer scientific explanations without writing in the middle of it, and here there's a miracle. We are so used to it that we don't think that is problematic. What it jolly well is, because that is not only not allowed, but it's not allowed because it's not necessary. Think about it. It's not allowed, not because some arbitrary person, not the president of the Royal Society, declared it's not allowed, but because it is not necessary. But that's new, because as late as Isaac Newton, and we think of him as one of us as science, as far as science is concerned, he's a modern, he's not an ancient. He solved his own equations of motion, and he had two problems. He couldn't figure out why all the planets go in the same direction. He thought it was cute because they do all the planets that he knew went in the same direction of rotation around the sun. And he couldn't figure that out from his own equations of motion. And worse, when he solved his own equations of motion, he discovered, according to him, the solar system was unstable. At some point, the planet would just fly off, which is no good. And you know what he said? Well, I know. God occasionally sent an angel to poke it. Newton said that in print. I mean, it sounded slightly better in Latin, but it sounded much more learned. But the fact is, he imported God in when he couldn't do the sums. And he didn't think it was at all odd to do it. And he wasn't censored. He was not, delisted from being a fellow of the Royal Society. He did that. This is Newton. This is not some ancient person, right? So the fact that you can actually give a completely naturalistic explanation without saying, hey, there's a miracle, is a thoroughly modern thing. But one whole century later, Pierre-Simon de Laplace, he showed, to his own satisfaction, that a proper application of Newton's own equations of motion, solving it to a high number of digits and solving them properly, would suffice to explain not only why the planets go around one way, but he thought he could prove that the solar system was stable. He was partially right, by the way. His explanation of why the planet all go around the same way was basically right. It turns out that no one can prove the solar system is stable, not even today, because 9 bodies the equation of motions are chaotic, you can't solve them. So Laplace was partially right, but never mind, that's what he did. So this was an apocryphal story, but I love it, and it may well be true, because I checked even the French websites say it, so it must be true. I'm not going to inflict my French on you because it's apparently absolutely awful, but when Napoleon was presented with a copy of Laplace's book, Celestial Mechanics, I think what this means is, but it nowhere mentions God. Napoleon said in utter surprise. Laplace's answer, famously, is, I do not have need of that hypothesis. To which Napoleon replied, if I would try French, arc would be Scottish. I don't know, how do you say R in French? Probably R, right? Except you don't pronounce the X, it's R, right? R. C'est une belle hypothèse. Ça explique beaucoup de choses. I told you my French is awful. But it's such a beautiful hypothesis. It explains so many things. Interesting conversation, right? Napoleon is still stuck in the stage of Newton. Laplace has gone thoroughly modern. I don't need that hypothesis. I don't need the God hypothesis. That's why it's not in my book. I don't find when I'm doing all my derivations and calculations, I need to say here there's a miracle. The need has dropped out. So I would like to call this the Laplace principle. In other words, it is possible to give satisfying naturalistic explanations of the workings of its universe without recourse to the God hypothesis. The attempt is very old. Lucretius, in the 1st century BC or AD, but around about then, he wrote a long Latin poem trying to do this, but no one believed him. So that's the Laplace principle. Laplace was the first in that apocryphal story to enunciate it. So there are 4 classic ways to respond to the fact that the Laplace principle appears to be true. One is the orthodox way. I don't use the word orthodox in any pejorative sense here, but that is the orthodox, in other words, the mainstream way, which is the order of the beauty of the universe, nevertheless manifests God's purposes. You may not need the God hypothesis, but the whole way the thing fits together, the order and the beauty, relates to or reveals God's presence and majesty. We have heard the quotation of Psalm 19, to which I'll come back. There's a deist way, which is the Laplace principle works because God wound the clock up and then went on holiday. That's why you don't need the divine hypothesis when you do your chain of explanation, because God intends it that way, wind the clock up, go on holiday. There's a smuggler's way, which is otherwise known as the God of the gaps. In other words, you smuggle God back in, you look for these little cracks. Science can't explain that. And God comes back in through the back door, which is called the gap. That never works. History repeats itself because no one listens. When people keep trying, intelligent design is one of those. I'll probably get lynched for that, but anyway. There's, of course, the atheist way, which is the successor of the Laplace principle has the most obvious possible meaning. There is no God. that which is not needed is redundant. Okay, so there are, broadly speaking, 4 ways of responding to it. If you think of more, let me know, but that's my classification scheme. I haven't thought about it for 30 years. But what I want to show you is there may well be a 5th way that actually takes into account a lot of this. There's even some truth in the atheist one, because that is the obvious interpretation. It takes the Laplace principle utterly seriously. Okay? But I'm going to try to show you a 5th way that I think resonates a little bit with 3 of these ways. It doesn't in any way resonate with the smuggler's way, but actually it probably does a little bit too, but is a different way. And in fact, this way is suggested by the shape of the entire biblical narrative. A long time ago, when Roy Clemens was the preacher at Eden Baptist Church in Cambridge, he one day got up in the pulpit and said, "My text this morning is the Old Testament." That was not the punchline. He says, "My text this evening will be the New Testament." So my text in the next 3 minutes is the whole Bible. It's dangerous to try to outdo Roy Clemens, but never mind. Okay, so the next 10 minutes is going to sound like a Sunday morning sermon and not a talk in science religion. Bear with me, because the next 10 minutes is going to be crucial. Let's look at the Old Testament story in one broad sweep. Supposing you arrange the Old Testament books in the supposed chronological order of events. This is, in theological terms, taking the shape of the canon seriously. The canon suggests that events happen this way. So let's take it at face value. Where was God in this whole story, from Genesis to Esther? In Genesis, God was everywhere. He was patrolling the garden, walking around, asking Adam, "Where are you?" I mean, God is very, very present personally. By the time 9 chapters forward, he's already slightly less obvious, he's slightly more reticent. The word is the Lord appeared, or in Hebrew was seen by Abraham. Interesting. God appears at the object as a passive voice, it was only seen by. By the time it got to Hagar, it wasn't even the Lord, it was the angel of the Lord. But that's interesting, that's not very far. We only got about 13 chapters into the story. In Exodus 20, when the people gathered at the bottom of Mount Sinai, be careful what you ask for. They were so afraid that they said to Moses, "Don't let God speak to us like that again or we'll die." God never spoke to the people like that again. God never scared the wits out of the whole of Israel again in the story. Be careful what you ask God for. God sometimes takes us seriously. So God never, in fact, in the entire Hebrew story, spoke to the whole nation again, as far as I know, directly, like the way he spoke at Mount Sinai. Numbers 6:12, when this is God saying to the Israelites, I, the Lord, make myself known to the prophets in visions. Not in any direct theophany, but in visions. In other words, not like the face-to-face encounter with Moses. By the time we get to Judges, I remember last time there's a fly flying around my presentation as well. I wonder if it's the same fly. They keep it in the bottle. Every time I speak in here, this is not last time CiS, last time I spoke in here, there was a fly flying over just that screen. Right. By the time you get to Judges, Gideon was complaining. He said to God, "Where are all the wonderful deeds that you used to do?" Right? That our ancestors recounted to us. By only get to Judges, you haven't got very far in the story. Gideon was complaining. You used to be around a lot more, What's going on here? It's only Judges, for goodness sake. Haven't got a king yet. 1 Kings 8:10, Solomon built a temple. We've got 2nd King now. A cloud filled the house of the Lord, but it's only a cloud. The Lord appeared to Solomon a second time, and amazingly, if you check for yourself, I did try to check. I didn't actually read the entire Old Testament before I gave this talk, but I once did attempt to check. The Lord, I don't think, ever appeared to anyone again in the Old Testament. If this makes you read the whole Old Testament tonight, it's my fault. But 1 Kings 18, Elijah and the prophets of Baal, as far as I know, was the last public miracle. One that is large scale, like the plagues in Egypt, large scale, no question about it. Everybody saw it. No one says this is a hoax. It's a large scale public miracle. That was the last one. We only got to Elijah. And 1 Kings 19, Elijah found God. Where? Where did Elijah find God? not in the earthquake, wind, or fire, but in the sheer silence. There's where he found God. Then the Lord said to Elijah after that experience, 1 Kings 19:15, I believe that's the last time God directly said anything to anyone in the Old Testament. 2 Kings 19:35, Hezekiah. That very night, the angel of the Lord sat down and struck down the Assyrians. This is when Hezekiah asked the Lord to help with the Assyrian invasion. And I think that was the last time the angel of the Lord did anything outside of dreams. Of course, the angel of the Lord appeared to Daniel in dreams and things, but that was the last time the angel of the Lord did anything. Not only did the Lord disappear, but the angel of the Lord disappeared. Last historical book of the Bible, the book of Esther. The word God, Adonai, the Lord, whatever, never appeared in the book of Esther. It's the last historical book. All you got was Mordecai, Esther's uncle, said when Haman persecuted the Jews, he said to his niece Esther, Queen Esther, who knows, perhaps you have come to royal dignity for just such as a time as this, just such as a time as this. Picks up a little bit like the book of Ruth. Ruth happened to be gleaning in the field of one of her ancestors. God was not mentioned. As soon as the king saw Queen Esther standing at the court, he won his favor. In other words, if you're not called by the king to see him, the king can chop your head off unless he happened to be in a good mood. Esther chanced her life to save the Jews. But it just so happens that the king was in a good mood. I mean, God was not mentioned anywhere in the book of Esther, but if you have followed the story this far, as C.S. Lewis said in one of the Aslan stories, you may not be able to see Aslan, but his paw prints are everywhere. Not mentioned in name, though. So if you want to follow this whole story, the Old Testament scholar, Richard Elliott Friedman, has written a book called The Disappearance of God. The Old Testament story of God is the Cheshire Cat story. Not even a grin left at the end. So that was my sermon on the Old Testament. Now go to the New Testament. What happens when you turn the pages after that? What appears next? Such a disappointment. Baby. There were lots of angels in the story, but baby. The next thing was baby. It didn't make any sense. And baby got nailed to a cross. I mean, and the execution was very, very public. Right? It's like the anti-miracle of Elijah confronting the prophets of Baal. This is completely public. The whole city was there. Everybody saw it. By comparison, all the resurrection appearances were kind of hush private and behind closed doors in a room to this person just outside the tomb and that. There's nothing public about it. And just a few weeks ago, we celebrated the Feast of the Ascension. I mean, you know this particular genre of art. This is Jesus' feet. This is Jesus, the patron saint of podiatrists. A cloud hid them from their sight. The actual Greek says, took him away, but in this particular case, the NIV, I think, has some justification for use the verb to hide, because he disappeared. I mean, the message can't be clearer. We're doing Cheshire Cat here. And so there's that famous cry from Isaiah. King James Version has it best. Verily thou art a God that hidest thyself, O God of Israel, the Savior. This is how people misread Bonhoeffer, by the way. This is not the death of God. Verily thou art a God that hidest thyself, O God of Israel, the Savior. This is not the death of God. This is about the God who is present through... Oh, I thought you said 5. No, that's better. Right. And what does Paul say about our own life, of discipleship, your life, is what? Hid. Here the verb really is to hide, is hid with Christ in God. And so what we need actually is to learn what I call a cruciform epistemology. Let me explain what I mean. Epistemology is the theory of knowledge. Now when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, truly this man was God's son. The first gospel, Mark in chapter 15, tells you that the centurion, a Gentile, had no need of the resurrection experiences, looking at the way Jesus died, said, truly, this man was Son of God, the first one to make a Christian confession. The cross is the ultimate Christian symbol of God's hidden presence. What does Paul say in 2 Corinthians? From now on, therefore, regard no one from a human point of view, even though we once knew Christ from a human point of view, we no longer know him that way. This means that the cross, quite apart from all the salvific, what's the posh theological word? That's the one, apart from all the soteriological implications of it, has epistemological implications. It affects the way we know. We no longer know Christ that way. So how does the cross affect the way we know? I should have hit in the very last line, the punchline, but never mind. Pretend you didn't see the last line. In other words, it is non-trivial, wholly non-trivial, to read God off the Jesus story. It's not meant to be obvious, and indeed the New Testament presents it as humanly impossible. You remember the Emmaus Road story? They've had the cross, they've had the resurrection, they've been walking with Jesus the whole way, and Jesus was expounding the scriptures. And what happens? They didn't recognize him. What then happened? This is Caravaggio at the back. When he was at table with them, he took bread, blessed and broke it and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened and they recognized him and he vanished from their sight. In other words, recognition was enabled, it's passive, recognition was enabled, then their eyes were opened, they didn't open their own eyes. In the context, this is the Eucharistic context, in the context of life lived in discipleship in the company of the faithful, as exemplified by the fact that we all commit ourselves to be done to what the bread is being done to, being broken and consumed. Recognition is divinely enabled in the context of life lived in discipleship in the company of the faithful. Philip said to Nathanael, when Nathanael objected, can anything good come out of Nazareth? He didn't give him an intellectual argument. He said, come and see. In the context of the Johannine community, it's about inviting him to join the discipleship of the faithful and see it from inside. So let's go to Psalm 19. The heavens declare the glory of God, the firmament shows his handiwork. In a lot of my experience, I'm afraid there's a lot of astronomers in the audience, but a lot of astronomers in this sort of context very often show a beautiful picture and then saying, God is glorious and God is powerful. Well, that's what John Horton did. He wrote a thing called Big Science, Big God, and he quoted Spurgeon, the creation shouts, gossips, and exclaims the glory of God in wordless revelation. And he said, he quoted Paul and then said, Paul says it's even more true today, we know so much more about creation and its wonders. Now think about it. Think about it in the context of what I just said. The heavens declare the glory of God. How do you understand the word glory? Whose sense of glory are we using? Are we just like the world being impressed by something that is really big? Whose idea of glory are we using when we say we look at the heavens as scientists and we see the glory of God? Whose sense of glory are we using? Is it the Johannine sense of glory? Because in John's gospel, Jesus being glorified is about the moment he was lifted up on the cross. That was the moment of God's glory in his Son. Not being impressed with something very big or very intricate or very ordered by any of our senses. Should we not be reading as Christians Psalm 19 in the light of the Johannine word of what he meant by doxa, by glory? His eternal power, divine nature has been seen through the things he has made, Paul in Romans 1. What kind of divine powers are we talking about? This is the same St. Paul who told us the message about the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved is the power of God, dunamis. Then he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for power, same word, I don't know why it is, because it's a footnote that I forgot to get rid of in the NRSV. It's made perfect in weakness. It's the same Paul used the word power to mean that in the Corinthian correspondence. What kind of power are we supposed to see of God when we see all the sort of things that we naturally say to people as Christian scientists, creation, obviously displays the power and glory of God. How are we using the words power and glory in there? It's worth reflecting. So I actually would like to put it to you the fact that we can offer completely naturalistic explanations of the world without resorting to divine intervention is actually, that is the glory and power of God. That is the glory and power of God, that this works, and it works that way. What other kind of God would have made a world in which we can actually do science that way? If I made the world, my wife would have told you I'm so egomaniac that I will make absolutely sure no one can ever explain anything without referring to me. Trump would have done the same, right? I'll probably get lynched by the CIA for saying that. Can you delete that on the recording? Anyway, this is glory and power issuing forth in kenosis. The word kenosis comes from Philippians 2, talking about Christ, God's Son, emptying himself. Okay? So the sort of power and glory, this sort of power and glory is embedded in the very fabric of creation. So this year is the 650th anniversary of the Julian of Norwich's revelations of divine love. In one of her revelations, Revelation 4, she talks about a hazelnut. So the context was she thought she was in her last illness. A priest was showing her a crucifix to meditate on, and she was looking at the crucifix, and somehow she got to hazelnut. If this was undergraduate theology essay, I would say, please explain. Logic needs filling in. But God showed Julian a hazelnut. Christ showed her a hazelnut. It is necessary for us to know the littleness of creatures in order to reduce them to nothingness in our judgment, so that we may love and have the uncreated God. The reason why we're not full at ease and heart and soul is because we seek rest within that, etc. But basically, her point here, so I'll leave you to read Revelation 4, but essentially, she was meditating on the fact that the hazelnut exists, the actual existence, independent existence of a hazelnut. So I wondered about this for a long time, logic needs filling in. So Grace Jensen's fantastic book, Julian of Norwich, says this: the cross is an extreme case of divine humility, of God emptying God's self of all power and self-assertiveness. The whole of the created order displays the same self-limitations of God as brought the world into being. We easily think of creation as the manifestation of God's supreme power, calling the beings in existence. There's truth in this, but it is truth which must be qualified by the cross. If the cross is the ultimate reference point, the supreme power is not domination. Supreme power is the power to restrict one's own force and foster the being of the other. Love, in the end, is the strongest power of all. In other words, in order for God to give something even as small and humble as a hazelnut an independent existence, God has to withdraw God's self enough to give at least a relative degree of independent existence of the created being. The fact that there's anything that can be considered an independent thing in creation is already a sign of divine humility. So I actually think the hazelnut, you can actually go all the way to the Laplace principle. That's why science works. And at the back of that is the cross. I think I'm very close to the end. So the cross is stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. In other words, the cross in the first century culture is the last place to find God, whether you're religious or secular. So science is deemed one of those places today, right? It's the least likely place to find God according to Dawkins. Well, actually, for me, I see my vocation as to stand at this cruciform place that is called science and witness the hidden presence of God without sound bites or knockdown proofs. And I tell you, that's painful, because this is how they taunted Jesus on the cross. He had no sound bites. In fact, the only sound bite he's got on the cross confirmed the fact that God wasn't there. So I was once a six-day creationist. That's my confession moment. Because I wanted something that science cannot explain. I was the gap sort of person. I was a smuggler. I want something that demands divine agency. That here, there's a miracle. So my story is told in a chapter in that book. So when people now taunt me, because they usually are taunt, if you're a scientist, how can you believe in God? It's a painful experience that I don't have a soundbite, I don't have a knockdown truth. I can't come down from the cross, so as to say. I can only say, it's very weak. Come and see. So my canonic theology of science is, let me just summarize. Laplace principle, the fact that we can do science at all. That is the power and glory of God. That kind of God, the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. And so that is how God uses the foolish shame device. And of course, lying at the back of that is the cross. So that's my cruciform epistemology. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Wilson. That was absolutely fascinating and really good to, so many things to think about there. I'll give you a couple of seconds to start thinking about questions. Does anyone? There's a lot to unpack in that. Let's start at the back there then.
Thank you very much, Wilson. I believe there was somebody, and I've not been able to find out, who said it's actually impious to invoke God as an explanation in sort of natural philosophy or science. Can you remember or know who that actually? Okay. Right.
Sorry, can't remember who might have said that.
Okay, thank you.
There's a hand over there.
Thanks.
And then there's a hand over here.
Thank you. Yeah, lots to think about there. I just wondered with the references from John, I would have assumed the glorification was the resurrection. Can you say more about why the glorification is the cross?
I think here I've referred you to all the commentaries.
Okay.
That's an issue on which no one has ever dissented. And in fact, the second half of John's Gospel is sometimes known as the Book of Glory. You know, when I'm lifted up, I will draw all men to me. Is called his hour of glory. The hour of glory was the hour of crucifixion. So, you know, I mean, if you email me, I can send you all the texts.
Okay, great. Thanks.
I didn't want to prove text all of it.
Yeah.
But there's no doubt in John's Gospel, the moment of glory was when Jesus was lifted up. He compared it to Moses lifting up the snake in the desert. But that's one of the very few issues that no Johannine commentaries ever disagrees from Origen to C.K. Barrett. So I'm quoting authority, which is a very non-Protestant thing to do. But anyway.
Thank you. I really enjoyed that. I found the walk through the whole Bible really intriguing. I think one of the questions I had was, of course, if I follow all the way through, there also comes the end where you've got Revelation, where you've got things like references in Peter about how that divine hiddenness is just for a time. So I wondered if you would, where suddenly Jesus will appear.
But the just for the time is for a limited time until the eschaton.
Yeah.
Well, of course, there is a dimension to realize eschatology, that we're supposed to be living the risen life now.
Yeah,
but
that's where I was going.
That risen life is hidden with Christ in God.
Okay.
That hidden life that risen life is hidden with Christ in God, although Ephesians, we're already seated with Christ in glory, but that life is hidden with Christ in God, which explains the pain of being a Christian Scientist. Mm-hmm. Being taunted all the time is the Christ taunt repeated all the time at me, and possibly other colleagues of mine in the room. And the only answer I've got is come and see how we live this life taking up the cross. There is no other, Fazam, there, God thing possible. That's my only answer. We are not in the eschaton yet.
Thank you very much indeed, Wilson. You've triggered lots of thoughts in our minds, I'm sure. A couple that spring to mind based on what you were saying about the hiddenness of God. I was reminded of what Einstein said in the context of, lots of things, but I remember saying that coincidence, which we often use to explain miracles, that it was just a coincidence. According to Einstein, coincidence was God's way of remaining anonymous. Now, he didn't believe in a personal God.
But people have said that his God is a Spinoza sort of God. But
but I'm just saying that from our point of view as a Christian, we can see that God can hide himself behind that appearance of a coincidence. And there are reasons why he doesn't want to overwhelm us with evidence. Because the second quote that comes to mind is from Aquinas, I think. To those with faith, no evidence is necessary, and to those without faith, no evidence will suffice. And then Jesus says to Thomas, blessed, you believe because you've seen. Blessed are those who believe who have not seen. So those are other, I think, corroborations of your thesis, I think, that God has a purpose in hiding himself to some degree.
So let me just respond to it with 2 comments. One is, what was your first thing? Yes, God acts through chance. For about 10 years, I liked that. I don't anymore, for the following reason. I wonder whether there's another smuggling step. You know, the gap here, to go to the gaps, the gap here is chance. So I feel uncomfortable with saying that. That's number one. Number 2, it so happens that I have a paper in Science and Theology, which is on my website, on the Thomas story, seeing what Thomas did in the upper room and mapping it to how J.J. Thomson discovered the electron and got a Nobel Prize. There's some very close similarities in how Thomas operated in that upper room to how J.J. Thomson discovered the electron and the nature of faith. If you're interested, that's either another talk in 10 years' time, or you can go read my paper, which is available online.
I do have a question, but I first want to answer the first question. I don't know who asked that about impious. Was that you? Yeah, so it just took me a while to remember, but I know John Milton made that argument, and several others did, specifically around the origin of the soul. Right? Where does souls come from? 2 main theories are God kind of just saps creationism of the soul, or traducianism, it's inherited from our parents through a natural biological process. And the argument for the natural biological process is that it's impious to suggest that God is demanded to act every time 2 humans decide to have sex.
You must give me that reference.
So, yeah. So that's the answer to that question. And the other question I had was, I just wanted to clarify, are you saying that God doesn't act in these miraculous ways as part of our scientific explanations, or God doesn't act in these miraculous ways, full stop?
I mean, I don't know what you're going to say about miracles.
I know, I'm sorry to preempt you then.
But, I mean, one of the striking things about the miracles, even in somewhere like John's Gospel, where he called them signs, it convinced no one. The disciples didn't understand. Mm-hmm. The others didn't believe. So I think, I mean, let us wait for your talk, but I mean, God, if it's got at all, it's either in everything and acts through everything or nothing. So to me, cutting some bits out and calling them miracles until I hear Bethany's talk remains problematic. I may change my mind. But I mean, God certainly acts, but what I'm saying is it's not trivial to read. I mean, if it is non-trivial to read God's ultimate act in human history, which is the incarnation and the life of Christ, there's certainly non-trivial. Mm-hmm. What makes us think it would be any less trivial to read God from the other book of God's words, which is the book of God's creation, is at least as non-trivial as having to look at a cross and say God, is at least as non-trivial as that, and that's supposed to be at its clearest possible manifestation. You know, quod erat demonstrandum.
Do we have any further questions?
Yes, Laplace and determinism. This is a very profound question. If you have the universe, the solar system going along according to certain laws, what actually causes things to happen? Is it the previous configuration of the planets causing the next configuration, or is it the entire set of laws that determine everything? I'm not going to answer that, but you have to think about those terms, it seems to me.
Of course. So profound questions are for philosophers. But, I mean, the way we think of laws is not obvious. I mean, there is a stream of theology, which is called occasionalism, which is a minority report in Christian theology, but it's a majority report in Islamic theology, where it says, if I drop my pen, first time I did this, I did it with a fountain pen and I've ruined it. So I now carry a plastic one, I don't mind ruining it. I drop my pen, and you said the law of gravity allowed me to deduce it goes as half gt squared. That's not the occasionalist view. God wills actively each moment the pen taking that position. And God can change God's mind at any moment. So next time I'm going to drop this pen here, it can just end up over there. Now, in that view, there's no problem. But in Christian tradition, we tend to favor God's love over God's power. That's a problematic statement. But so that pole wins. But that brings in the whole free will, blah, blah question. But what I'm saying is that the whole law thing is not obvious. Another view is possible.
It's clear that in the Middle Ages they argued a lot about these
Yes, indeed.
things. The universalism as against Ockhamism, which is just what you pointed out. So there are some big questions here.
Yeah, no, I'm not saying that's not a question. I'm saying the question has been around for a long time. Just the Christian tradition has opted for one side, and perhaps the Islamic mainstream has opted for the other, and that's a whole new different discussion.
Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. I do love that simple summing up. Laplace principle equals power and glory of God. A lot to think about, and I found it very helpful. You also, as far as persuading others are concerned, your line seems to be, come and see. I'm in correspondence with an atheist who wants to persuade me otherwise. And as far as he is concerned, it is the Christian and the Christian world that is proof that the Bible is evil and God, if he exists, is evil. How do I get round that?
I mean, it depends on whether you want to riposte or being helpful. The riposte is, as far as I'm concerned, the atomic bomb proved that physics is evil. But there's a riposte, which is probably unhelpful. But I mean, the only helpful bit, as far as Philip and Nathaniel goes, is come and see. And I can personally, as a practicing scientist, I can say that with some conviction, because I can say to my atheist friends, I have become part of the scientific enterprise. I've seen it from inside. So how about you do me the courtesy of coming to the middle of the Christian enterprise and see it from inside? So I can say that because I'm a practicing scientist. I have come, I have seen, and I have stayed. I stay at what I consider the foot of the cross. That's my mission. But you know, I think there has to be some reciprocity. I have done science, the honor of joining science, seen it from inside. So how about you come and see what happens? I mean, I don't think there's any other way. I mean, I think that is the New Testament way of doing evangelism, as suggested by Philip. I don't necessarily mean come to my local church and join me for the next, sermon that even I disagree with. But never mind. But it's come and join this life of discipleship and watch discipleship from inside as a community.
Thank you, Wilson. That's really, really helpful, really practical to end on.